صلوات على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعجل فرجهم. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء المرسلين حبيب الله العالمين أبي القاسم المصطفى محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعجل فرجهم وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين. Assalamu alaikum everybody. Today we're going to be continuing our second lesson in our book that we've previously discussed, the 50 lessons on principles of belief for the youth by Ayatollah Nasir Makaram Shirazi. So he goes into explaining 50 different questions in this book and giving details and responses to each of them. Now we're going to go ahead like last time when we went through two questions about why we would need Allah in our life or what the need is to even search. So after answering those questions, the next question that we might have about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to be in this lesson, understanding God. So let's go ahead and begin, and inshallah you will be aware of what we are discussing about specifically, inshallah, as we go inside to the lesson. So as we go ahead, we can begin. So how can you come to know God? Knowing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has two different ways. How would I be able to understand that there is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and that He exists? We find two specific ways as to how we can find Him. There's the inward way, which we say is the closest way. That is the way that I can find Him within myself. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there is a way for me to understand Him, and I have to look inward. Now the second aspect is the outward way. This one is very clear. This one is a logical way that we can understand it, and that is through looking at the world. We can call this the external way or the more clear way. Through these two methods, we're able to understand who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is, and we can confirm His existence, we can say, through these two different methods. So we're going to go ahead and look into both of those today, and inshallah we'll be able to understand it. We won't be going on to the second aspect that will be going on to our next lesson, but we want to specifically confirm how this inward way works. How can I confirm that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala exists only through looking within myself? That might be a very good question that you would have right now. Well, let's go ahead and see what that discussion is. So we're going to go ahead to our next aspect, and this is the inward way. This is fitra. Fitra is something that we're just going to go into right now. Many of you may already know what that means. Scholars say that every human being who thinks, from whatever class, whatever race he is, if he's left alone, without anyone helping him out, without anyone, if he's just left alone by himself, that he doesn't need any special training and he doesn't hear anything, he'll end up worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Nor the words of materialists, that person will naturally become aware of a force of power which is above nature, which rules all the world. So, like we said, this fitra is this innate nature, we can call it, or the human nature. And this is a nature in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has put into insan for them to be able to understand that He would exist without needing any external factors, like for example, their friends telling them, or their parents telling them, or their teachers telling them. This is something that they find within themselves. Now, you might reject this, but we're going to go ahead further and we'll try to prove what this way, fitra, and how it exists. So, we will move on to the next aspect, which would be it's possible that one might become occupied. One might be so busy within their world. They might be within such a material world that they might even lose the sense of fitra. They might see that that fitra would be completely gone. And we see that in our own daily lives, even today, that so many people, they have that level of fitra within them. They have that God understanding nature, or that nature in which they look for God. But over time within life, they fall into material aspects. And as a result of this material aspect, they might completely, that fitra might become smaller. It might not become as apparent as it is, for example, as it would be for us. But it will never disappear. This is a really important aspect of fitra. Fitra can never disappear. And we'll tell you exactly where you can hear this fitra, or you hear this sound. Let's say that one finds himself in problems. One finds himself in a situation where they're in an earthquake, they're in a hurricane, a tsunami, any kind of natural disasters that exist. In those specific moments, they know that no one can help them. They're in that moment where they feel truly alone, that they don't have anyone to be able to save them in that situation. We would know that they completely separate themselves from material life and they get attached to their fitrah. In this specific moment, they are in need of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this is the fitrah that we find, that when they find no place for refuge, they would turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this is a nature that sometimes might disappear, might be smaller, it might not be as noticeable, but at the end of the day, it will occur no matter what. So in moments of weakness, we can find ourselves having our fitrah the strongest. The inward way, let's continue. Our history shows that even the most powerful of rulers, that those who had so much power, in those moments of power, they lose that sense of fitrah. Or it becomes so small where they completely ignore it. We have an example here, of course, Fir'aun. Fir'aun completely rejected this idea of a God and considered him the God himself. In that moment, he basically didn't have a sense of fitrah, but once he starts to lose power, once he realizes that Hazrat Musa alayhi salam is about to take the Bani Israel across that river, then he's afraid. In that moment, the water is coming down on him. We see that in the Quran, Fir'aun is repenting to Allah in that moment. Fir'aun is saying, Ya Allah, I believe that you're there. We see that in that moment when he knows that he can't be saved, he asks for Allah. But it's too late, of course. At that point, there's no saving and Fir'aun is drowned. But we can see that as a ruler at the time, or rulers, they usually don't see that sense of fitrah when they have so much power. But as a result of losing power, many in those moments, they are so afraid when there's no one to help them to save that, they turn to Allah, they turn to a higher power. So that's when fitrah becomes stronger, as we previously discussed. If you study the real reasons for this, you will agree that a light shines from there which calls you to Allah. Perhaps there's been times when you've met with difficulties. So think about it in your own personal life, right? Maybe you might have seen Allah in your life, or there might have been a time where the fitrah was strongest for you yourself. So that's a sense of reflection that we can have. That we have so many difficulties, that we have so many problems, and there's no way to completely solve them. In those moments, we can find ourselves in a force of nature, or a force of fitrah. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the closest at those times. In this moment, a hope mixed with love fills your spirit and soul, and it removes the clouds of darkness from our soul. This is the closest way in which a person can take to God. And this is what we mean by the inward way. When we look within ourselves and we look at moments within our lives where we're completely lost, or we don't know what is going to happen, in those moments, our fitrah shines the brightest. And it's that moment where you understand that there's no one to help me except for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's the inward way and how it works. And we have Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in a verse, Surah 29. فَإِذَا رَكِبُوا فِي الْفُلْكِ دَعُوا اللَّهَ مُخْلِصِينَ لَهُ الدِّينَ فَلَمَّا نَجَّاهُمْ إِلَى الْبَرِّ إِذَا هُمْ يُشْرِكُونَ. Now if they embark on a boat, they call on God, making their devotion sincerely to Him. But when He has delivered to them safely, or to dry land, behold, they give a share of their worship to others. So this is very simple. Those who, for example, are on a boat ride, they know that their only hope in those moments is Allah. So in those moments, when they're in that boat, they call on Allah. Ya Allah, help me in this boat ride so I'm able to arrive safely. But once they reach on land, they all call to others. For example, their mind is away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this verse basically shows that level of fitrah that Allah is explaining. He's saying that those people in those moments, they completely forget about Allah after they've reached land. So that is the aspect of fitrah that Allah shows in the Quran. So let's move on to our reflections. And this is where I touched upon previously. Has a complicated problem ever arisen in your life, where a solution seemed completely unlikely, where you're completely lost? Has it been in those moments that you found Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or you found yourself calling to a higher power? And a lot of us can say yes. There might be some who, for example, wouldn't have had that kind of experience. But I would say most of the people in their life, they could find a moment in which they're completely lost. They're completely afraid, or they don't know what's going to happen. They are going to call Allah in those moments. So even you yourself could have that. But this is a sense of reflection that we can have based on our lesson on fitrah. So let's move on to our next question. And this is the question that we are going to ask. So this is the fourth question. Now this question is it possible that our inner voice, which we call the voice of our God-given nature, that voice that we call as fitra, isn't it something that has been formed as a result of our environment around us for it to be normal? Someone might come over and ask this question. You say this is fitra that you have within your heart or within your soul in those moments where you ask for God. It's not even fitra. This is, for example, your parents told you this, your teacher told you this, that's why you believe in this fitra. It doesn't even exist at all. And it's a valid question. We have to know how would we answer to this. How can we prove fitra to those people that might say that this fitra is a conditional thing. It's based on your environment. Because your dad told you that this thing exists, you think that it exists. So let's answer that question. It's a really important question for us to be able to understand. And the answer is as follows. It goes into multiple different aspects. Customs can change, right? Your environments, different types of environments. We can find a custom that has not changed throughout history among all nations. It's not possible that we can have such a custom that's always happened, like fitra has. So as someone who says it's because your parents told you or it's because society told you so, societies change. There's no two societies that would be the same as opposed to 1,000 years ago or 1,500 years ago and today. Yet we find that whenever we look at every single nation on the earth, without exception, all of them are rooted in fitra. All of these different types of nations, without any connection to each other in a sense of their customs or their culture, you find that each of them specifically believe in this fitra, or they believe in this higher power, that a higher power exists. Now, some people over time might have called it, for example, different type of gods. They would have called it different names, or we can see that some people, for example, fell to polytheism. They became mushriks. They believed in multiple gods. But that doesn't reject our point. Our point is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or whatever you call him, a higher power, has existed in every single society without exception that we look at. So that's a really important, clear introduction to this. So as we move, we say that, as stated by sociologists and historians, there's been no time in history when the belief in God has not existed among people. Rather, in every age and every time and every single moment, some form of belief has existed within every society. We even have rules which show that tribes who lived before written history began with some kind of a belief system. Of course, there's no doubt that at those times when people are forgetting God as the being who is above nature, they searched for him and looked for him among creatures in nature. They made idols for themselves of things in nature. So even before written history, we find that those who, for example, didn't believe in a God or so, they find themselves looking towards a higher power. Even those that, for example, didn't know of a God or know the concept of God, we find them still looking for something to believe. And we see that they might, for example, make a rock or so, or make a sculpture to portray as their own higher power and pray to it. So you see that this exists in many societies. And our second aspect is some of the well-known sociologists, psychologists, have clearly and directly said that the human spirit or soul has four senses. The soul has four senses. The sense of knowledge, which sends someone to science. They want to learn more. So insan as a being is always interested in learning more. This is one of the natures of the soul of insan, that it wants to keep on looking. The sense of goodness, the sense of finding a moral, when there's a moral problem, that they're able to find goodness within that. So they're always trying to find or solve human issues in the best possible way that they can, or the most moral or ethical. A sense of beauty, this is found in poetry, literature, from Shakespeare to, of course, even before Maulana. We find that every single time insan has been attracted to beauty of different aspects, types of arts. And the fourth, which is most important that I want to pay attention to, the sense of belief that they have to come to know God and to implement his commands. In this way, we see that a sense of worship is one of the senses with the deepest roots of the spirit. That is, that they're never, ever separate. It's not possible for any human to be separate from this one piece of nature. All of these four, of course, we want to pay attention to number 4. And number 4 is saying that we have to basically implement that kind of belief, and we will have to have that connection to a higher power. So this has existed at all times within our own history. Now, number 3, to be able to answer that question, let's look at this. In our future lessons, we're going to go ahead and look into this, but some people who are materialists, some people who pose this question, even believe in a higher power. They might not accept that it's a higher power, but they call it different names, right? You know that today, Something that I found to be quite interesting is many people aren't religious, meaning that they would believe in God or they would be believing in a religion or so. But what do people say? I am spiritual. I'm connected. What does that mean? Well, this is a kind of way that we can understand that. They might call it different names, but in a sense, they feel that sense of fitra. That spirituality that they have without believing in a God is a belief in a higher or a mystical power. Or they might call it nature. Some people have tended to call this nature as a way to create everything. It's been a result of something that has existed, but it is nature. I'm connected to nature spiritually. We hear that a lot of times, but that's just a way to understand that they still have fitra. It's not incorrect to say that they don't have fitra, but rather, it won't be correct to say that, but rather they do have fitra, but they have different names for it. So, all of this explanation holds for nature which lacks awareness. Is it possible that nature, which doesn't even have a sense of awareness or consciousness, that it could create such a thing, instead of believing in, for example, an all-knowing or infinite God who could have created the universe, that they could have just put it onto nature? Well, we would reject that, of course, but that's a way for us to be able to understand. So, just to conclude this lesson, a love for God has always existed in us, and it will always continue. It's not possible for such a thing to be removed. Faith in God is an external flame which warms our heart and spirit. In order to come to know God, we're not obliged to take a long and complicated way. You don't need to search for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wherever you go, but rather you can find Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala within ourselves. And if we turn inward, we can have that faith in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this is our lesson today that we've had on fitra, and hopefully it's shined a light on this understanding or this concept for us to be able to understand better. That no matter what, this fitra can never be completely removed from oneself. And when one wants to find God, they can go ahead and look inward without even needing to go outward. Inshallah, in our next lessons, we're going to go ahead and look a bit outwardly, and we'll see what we need to understand Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and prove His existence through an external factor. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, وَلَقَدْ خَلَقْنَا الْإِنسَانَ وَنَعْلَمْ مَا تُوَسْوِسُ بِهِ نَفْسُهُ وَنَحْنُ أَقْرَبُ إِلَيْهِ مِنْ حَبْلٍ وَرِيدٍ. We are closer to the human being than his jugular vein. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is closer to you than even that. So find Allah, since He's so close. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is basically pointing towards fitra in this. That we are so close to you. I'm even closer than your own jugular vein. So find me within yourself through this fitra. Let's end off, of course, with our reflections. These are two important questions that you might want to reflect on. Just like before with our previous reflections, when we said that, when have you found yourself in instances where you're attracted to fitra, in problems or difficulties? Now let's look at our other reflections. Why do ignorant people turn to idol worship? Why is it that, for example, in the past or so, when they needed to believe in a God or they needed to believe in something, why do you think that it's possible that they would have gone to idol worship instead of believing in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or believing in one God? That's a question that, of course, we can reflect on. It has a very straightforward answer, so it's more of a question for you. I'll leave that to you, of course. And the second would be, why do materialists refer to God as nature? Why do you think that it's difficult for materialists themselves to accept that there is a God, an all-knowing God that exists, that is possible for Him to have created everything? But rather, those who, for example, would say that it's nature that's created, something that's completely doesn't have a conscious, that it would have created such the world that we have today. So these are two questions that we can go ahead and think about. I'm sure all of you would have answers, but that's going to be the end. We have the end of our lesson, and let's finish it with a salawat. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad wa ajil farajahum.